So a lot of the folks at the VA at their desk doing a job, but the veterans, they live the story that's in the C-file and are a lot better equipped to spot the details that support their story when they don't fit, as you said, the round peg in the round hole.
Yep.
The way that, that they need to at the regional office or higher level review level.
Yep. As you said, we shouldn't take the whole episode, but we had a case where the fellow said he was hospitalized, mental health in the service. They kept saying they couldn't find the records. Find any records. Ultimately, we forced the VA to produce his unit morning reports.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA. If you're a veteran struggling with the VA's disability system or just want to make sure you're getting the benefits you've earned, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an update that could change your life. I'm Kristian Terison, here with renowned veterans disability attorney Francis Jackson of Jackson and MacNichol. Jack has dedicated his career to helping veterans like you win the benefits you deserve, recovering millions of dollars for thousands of heroes. This podcast isn't just for veterans navigating the system, though. It's for their families, their friends, and anyone else who wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who've served. So stick around, because we're here to make sure you get the support you need. So today's episode is using your C-file like a weapon. So how reviewing, annotating, becoming familiar with the contents of your VA claims file can provide you the tools to be successful in your VA disability claim. So starting with the basics,
Sure.
What is the VA C-file?
The C-file is just an abbreviation for the claims file. And it started out as just a paper file. Piece of paper would come in, they'd put a two-hole punch in it, stick it on the prong in the folder. Next piece of paper came in, they'd add that on top, and just continue to accumulate them.
And I know we request the C-file for every veteran who crosses our threshold. Why is it so important for every veteran to have a copy if they're pursuing a claim?
Well, you have to know what the VA is looking at in order to make sense of what they're doing. And one of the things that is particularly important is to know if there are things missing from the C-file. We have had, over the years, a number of cases where the VA just has the claims file. They get the service medical records, but there are two things that don't come automatically. One is the personnel records. The other is any service hospital records. Keep in mind that hospital records are kept separately by the hospital rather than in the veteran's medical file, his service medical records. So if there's an issue where someone was hospitalized and those records are relevant, the VA probably doesn't have them. Mm-hmm. If there's something in the veteran's personnel records that's relevant, the VA may well not have them. Sometimes they get the personnel record, but generally speaking, they don't seem to.
So that C-file really becomes the map of your case, what's there and what's not there.
That's right.
So why is it a risk for veterans to just assume that the VA has all the records and knows what's in the file? They create it, it's in their computers.
Well, the problem is that a lot of the critical pieces in the file, they didn't create. The service created. And sometimes those copies are, at best, barely legible. Sometimes they're actually illegible. But the veteran typically knows what happened to him or to her. And so if you have a barely legible copy, the veteran can usually figure out what it actually says, which is often important. But more than that, keep in mind that the VA system isn't organized the way you might think it was. You would think that if somebody files a claim, it would go to somebody at the VA and they would sit down and read the whole file. But it doesn't work like that. What happens is the file gets assigned to this national work queue, gets on somebody's work queue, and they start on it. But when they get to the point of saying, oh, well, we need to set up a C&P exam, they make an entry asking for a C&P exam, and then it's off their desk. And so nobody ever sits down and goes through the file end to end to create a chronological narrative. And that's what you have to do, whether you're the veteran or the veteran's attorney. You have to sit down and go through and figure out the whole panoply of information and how it all fits together. And one of the things that you will often find is that there are things missing, whether they might be in hospital records or in personnel records or simply not recorded. But you have to figure out, okay, this is the narrative of what happened. We can show that these pieces happened because we can see that in the file. These pieces we can't show from the file. So we have to figure out, okay, are those pieces important? Are they necessary to win the case? If so, how are we going to prove them? And that's the analysis that you have to make every time. And for example, we had one case where the gentleman said, I was hurt in an accident when I was stationed in Germany. And that's why I've got all these current orthopedic problems. And the VA said, well, we agree that you were in the service, you were in Germany, you have current orthopedic problems, but we don't see anything about any accident, and you haven't proven your claim. So we got his personnel file, and a typical personnel file runs anywhere from 40 to a couple hundred pages, depending. But we dug into his, and lo and behold, there's the part where he tries to beat the tram across the track in Germany, gets the vehicle he's driving gets hit by the tram, and he's injured. And that's the missing piece that the VA said just didn't exist. So we got those personnel file records, submitted them to the VA, explained how it all fit together, and ultimately won the case because that was the missing link.
I worked on one where right there in the C file, so this is something that whoever was reviewing and deciding this case should have had access to, but they were handwritten service treatment records.
Yep.
These were early 1970s, and they're supposed to follow the chronology. So there's a date and then a handwritten entry of who they saw, what happened, et cetera,
Right.
et cetera. On 2 pages of these service treatment records, a psychiatric provider had written notes kind of down in the left-hand corner, added a separate date, and described some of the key symptoms and complaints. Hadn't been maintaining their personal appearance, was late and was complaining of other problems. And that made all the difference in the case because the VA's view was you never had any psychiatric symptoms in service. There was no mental health problems in service.
Yep.
And they had just been scrawled in there by a provider in a rush who didn't have a fresh page or what have you down in the corner of the service treatment record.
Yep.
And again, the whole case hinged on those couple of paragraphs.
Yep, and that can happen. We had a case where the gentleman started having mental health problems in the service. The VA did not acknowledge that he had any mental health problems in the service. But when you went through his records, he'd gotten Article 15s for things like walking off the base, just lost in space, and gotten in disciplinary trouble for not having his uniform on properly and not showing up for his assignments. And it was very clear when you looked at his current mental health condition, that this was the beginning of it. But if you just read down and said, yeah, oh, he was just a disciplinary problem, and that was that, and that was the VA's take. But we ultimately won that case.
I had another. I don't want to make this whole episode a bunch of
War stories.
war stories. Yeah, but I had another where this fellow, his MOS was like laundry, and so he claimed that he had Agent Orange exposure because they had him out on the perimeter clearing, spraying the defoliant to keep the perimeter clear when he wasn't doing the laundry.
Yep.
And VA said, no evidence of that, no record of that. And going through that C file, page by page, a crooked typewritten record that was 40 years old had notes about, oh, yep, he was out with this other guy, and they had an incident where somebody fell from one of the watchtowers, and he was there when it happened. And that was
Because he
enough.
was out on the perimeter.
Because he was out on the perimeter spraying Agent Orange.
Yep.
So a lot of the folks at the VA at their desk doing a job, but the veterans, they live the story that's in the C file and are a lot better equipped to spot the details that support their story when they don't fit, as you said, the round peg in the round hole, the way that that they need to at the regional office or higher level review level.
Yep. As you said, we shouldn't take the whole episode, but one other one. We had a case where the fellow said he was hospitalized for mental health in the service. They kept saying they couldn't find the records, didn't find any records. Ultimately, we forced the VA to produce his unit morning reports. And it showed not only that he was gone, because he was at the hospital, but there was a specific notation that another person had been assigned to go with him take him to the hospital. So ultimately the VA backed down and paid the case. But it's so frustrating sometimes that VA has such a hard time taking people's word for what happened.
So I know a lot of veterans are shocked by how big the C file can be. Sometimes we get a short one would be 500, 600 pages, but we've had some real monsters come through the door, 40,000 plus pages.
Yep.
Thank goodness they're doing digital versions these days. But where would you recommend that a veteran even start when they're looking down the barrel of thousands of pages?
Well, it depends on what the issue is. Keep in mind that most of the time, the critical pieces from the original service records are going to be notations about medical conditions. So, for example, we had one fellow who service medical records are missing. They said, sorry, too bad, can't help you. Nothing to show that you had these problems. Well, in fact, there was what they call a physical profile. He had been limited in marching and running and other stuff because of problems with his legs, which is what he'd been telling the VA all along. But there was the physical profile sheet that said he's limited in doing these things because of problems with his legs. So they were no longer able to say, well, there's no evidence of problems with your legs in the service. And sometimes it's just as simple as going through the file page by page until you find the relevant piece of evidence.
And one thing I would like to mention to any of our tech-savvy viewers, the temptation is always there to make the C file, the digital C file, searchable. But when you do that, there are a lot of things that can be missed. So if you're trying to save some time by using a searchable PDF file and just looking for hypertension or keywords, I've had a number of times where it's clear that's what the VA is doing themselves, using that search function.
Yep.
And handwriting or bad copies, things like that. There are a number of things that stop the search function from working correctly, And there really is no substitute for laying eyes on it, even though it is, in many cases, a big time commitment.
Well, the thing is, as you said, make it searchable will sometimes speed things along. I mean, you know, get you right to what you need. But if it doesn't, you got to go back and do it the old hard way.
Yeah, no, there's no harm in trying, but don't let that be the definitive answer if you don't find what you know should be in there.
That's right.
And speaking of what you know should be in there, so what is the difference between, with the VA terms a complete C file and an incomplete one, and what can veterans do to try and find any of that missing information?
Well, as you know, there was a big fire at the records repository in St. Louis in, I think it's 1973, if I remember correctly. And a lot of old, pre-73 obviously, Army records, service records, including service medical records, were burned. The VA went to actually fairly extraordinary lengths to try to salvage the remnants and did some interesting stuff with drying them and freezing them and all of this stuff to try to save the records and salvage them. But my point was there are some folks for whom those records are just permanently missing. So when that happens, you have to go to some kind of secondary sources. And so if you were hospitalized in the military, the hospital records are separate and probably were not destroyed. They may be hard to locate. That's a different problem, but they probably weren't destroyed. You may need to try to contact people you were in the service with and get what the VA calls a buddy statement. It's just a written statement from that person saying, yeah, I was there and this happened. Or sometimes it's as simple as you have a situation where someone got married just before they went in the service or just after they went in the service, and they're now complaining that they developed back problems in the service, and the spouse can say, well, I knew him before he went in the service, or when he first went in the service. He didn't have any trouble with his back, and after he came out, he was always complaining about his back, and he'd wince and groan and stuff if he picked up something heavy. And there are a number of ways you can get at a set of facts, even if the underlying records no longer exist. So that's what you have to do in those cases, is you have to figure out how to go around this problem and prove it separately.
I'll never forget one case that I had worked on. We were trying to find a particular record about immunization with the injector
The injector
gun.
guns, yep.
Yeah, and we tried everything we could think of, requests to every different organization. They all came back, oh, sorry, there's no record, there's nothing at this date, et cetera, et cetera. On a whim, the veteran happened to be in the neighborhood of a particular VA facility where he remembered getting these injections one time, and he just went to the desk and he said, hey, we've been looking for this record, we've had no luck. I was wondering, person to person, if you could just take a look for me. And the guy goes back and he said, oh yeah, we have these few weird boxes of stuff that, kind of stuck in the back of the filing cabinet, didn't know what it was, where it went. And the guy behind the counter took the time, went through these couple of yellowed banker's boxes, and found a chunk of records that contained, this veteran's name, his social, and that he had the injections on that day. They had to redact everybody else who was on there, but it was one of those needle in a haystack moments where you never know.
There it is.
You never know.
Yep.
But, evidence is evidence. We'll take it how we can get it.
Yeah, and, there was an article, it's been a couple of years at least, but a VA employee was trying to find records about a group of people. I'm not remembering the details now. Might have been folks who were stationed on Guam, but don't hold me to that. But the reason that there was this article is she had found this whole set of records that showed service connection for like a group of a couple thousand different people. And these records had just been stuck away in an odd spot, and nobody found them. And ultimately, she was determined she was going to find the records because she knew there had to be records, and she found them and got written up with a commendation for having done the digging and found the records. But there are so many of those weird things where, there's just different government records of various sorts. For example, we had a situation where a gentleman claimed that he had PTSD from his time in the Marines. He said when he first went in the Marines, he was stationed at Camp Pendleton, and there were a couple of suicides that happened that really just shook him up. He was never right after that, and they said, oh, no. So we finally did a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, for deaths at Camp Pendleton during a certain time period and which ones were suicides. And we were able to show that, yep, there were a couple of suicides right in the time period he was talking about at Camp Pendleton. Mm-hmm. One guy just walked out into the traffic on I-4, and I've forgotten the other one. I think the other one hung himself, but it doesn't matter. The point is that there were records that supported what he had said, but the VA simply hadn't gone to the trouble to find them.
Nobody's going to care about your case quite like you're going to care about your case. And that's what it comes to at the end of the day. Well, except maybe your lawyer, if they're doing their job right.
Yes. Don't forget us.
And on that note, this has been another episode of Victory Over VA. Thank you for tuning in. Please be sure to like and subscribe to join us again next week.
We'll hope to see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.